All right, here we go. Let's see. Here we go. Okay, I think we're live. I want to welcome everybody to Facebook Live here at the Vitality Project. I'm Bob Weathers, and I'm with my dear friend Michael Morar. Michael's in San Antonio, Texas. Hopefully safe, healthy, and well. Michael. And
hey, Bob. How's it going?
it's going pretty good. It's going pretty good. I just got off of an hour conversation online. You might have been able to see some of it with Kara from South Africa, and really cool what she's doing down there. She's got a Facebook Live group called Lockdown Open Up, and her whole emphasis from a lay perspective, you'll appreciate this, Michael, from a lay perspective is to help destigmatize talking about mental health more generally and addiction more specifically. And for her, as with you and as with me, it touches very close to home, both personally and also in her family. And I was just deeply touched by it. I'd met her once before. It's such a trip, isn't it, that we can meet somebody once and feel a kinship with them that is not bound by time and space and language and culture and continent and hemisphere. I was pretty blown out by that. I was just really struck by that. And if that's true for her, who I've met now twice, it's true for you and me in spades. We haven't seen each other in the flesh in the better part of 3 years. I think that's probably pretty close to accurate, as you complete your doctoral studies in Texas. And I feel deeply connected to you. You're a part of my, I think you know this, Michael, you're part of my meditation quiet time every morning. I think I am going to call it prayer. I was going to say I hesitate to call it prayer. Whatever somebody calls prayer, let it be whatever it is for them. And it's the way I hold you closely. And it's virtually every morning, including this morning. And I say that because there's a host of people. It's a small host that I feel like are very much with me spiritually, kind of implicitly throughout the day. And you are one that I value most highly. So just for you to know that,
Yeah, thanks, Bob. I appreciate you saying that, and it means a lot. And I was actually thinking about something like this yesterday or the day before. I was reading things that most of us know anyway, but it was just reminding me of, it was reading of when we meet people that have maybe similar worldviews or similar interests, that we're much more likely to spark a relationship or a friendship with. And at least the way that it was written and the way I was thinking about it is that although we have that, that there's also, I think that helps certainly. And I think I'm not even sure I knew completely what your worldview was. I think it took me a while, actually. And as a matter of fact, I didn't think that we had the same worldview. In fact, not exactly.
Interesting.
And so I guess I was just thinking of the space in between what it was written in this text about, in the article around when we meet people that we have similar worldviews and we kind of strike a friendship with, is that I thought of you in terms of how instantly it was kind of like just add water, and
that is great. I've never heard that applied that way. That was great.
That might be the corniest thing I say all day today. Okay, but
it strikes me as profundity. That is great. That's great. Like some kind of freeze dried substance. Just add water and we're good to go. That's great.
Yeah.
So
I still have this image of when you and I were walking across the street from Cal Southern to go eat sushi. And I knew even before we got to the crosswalk that we were going to run out of time in all that was kind of coming up.
That's great. I tell you what I'm flashing on as I'm listening to you. Sometime in the last 10 years, probably maybe 7-8 years ago, I was invited to speak up in Los Angeles at a treatment center up there whose name I've forgotten, and they're a national treatment center, and I can't call up the name of them. It probably is just as well. We'll keep it anonymous. And I was to speak on addiction. And I was early in my own recovery from addiction, very early, and was doing a lot of reading, a lot of preparing for this presentation because it was so close to what was going on in my life. And I was sitting in the back. I got there early that day. It was a training. It was going to be training for clinicians there. And I was sitting in the back row, and there was a woman. She was a African-American woman, probably roughly my age. And I think when I got there early, so I just kind of announced myself, or maybe was announced and said hello to whoever was staging the event. And I'm going to get the sequence right. This is right. And then I got up and I presented. And I think I presented for some period of time and then had people do some kind of written exercise or maybe small groups or something. So there was a break in the action. So I actually had a chance to get up and speak for a little while. And I came to sit down by this woman in the back row. That might have been the only seat that was available. And she leaned over and she whispered in my ear, and I've never forgotten this. She said, "You're one of the thirsty ones." Isn't that incredible? I've never forgotten that. I was so deeply touched, and I looked at her in the eyes, and she had a gleam in her eye, and I think I just smiled in acknowledgement of it. But I've never forgotten that, and that's the better part of a decade ago. It reminds me of this book. It just happens to be on my desk because it happens to be on my desk every day as inspiration. This book by Daniel Stern, that among other things is the inspiration for the title of our project here. It's not the primary inspiration, but it's the second one. His idea of forms of vitality. I told you an experiment that I tried years ago. I was teaching a class that required for me to drive an hour each day to the class. And it was a class on substance abuse counseling. It was at a local university. And I remember I had met with the students once, maybe twice, I can't remember. All I know is I was driving there and I looked down, I had the list of, it was like the printout, in a university, the printout of students. They're all listed there with their social security numbers or something. And I think there's maybe a dozen or so students. I don't even know how many. And to say I was driving would be inaccurate. I was driving right by UCLA on the 405, which means I was creeping along, which is why it took me so freaking long to get to the university. So I'm creeping along, which gave me a chance to kind of make these furtive glances down at the list. And what I did, Michael, and it just came spontaneously, it'd be like if your and my names were on the list or something. I began looking down the list, and I had just enough experience to know when I looked at a person's name who that person was. But I had very little exposure. I don't think I'd probably read any of their assignments. And what I was struck by, and it really was one of these epiphanies, is that every single person, as in the spirit of this book, I think I might have been reading this book, maybe at the same time, every person had a very clear, what Daniel Stern, the developmental psychologist, would call a very clear form of vitality. And it's not about whether they're happy or sad. It's not about whether they share the same worldview. It's about what animates them. It's all about their signature. And what I was struck by was how absolutely within a week or two at most, there was already established a very clear felt sense of every student on that list. And I came to the class and I told them what I just told you right now. I said, it's amazing. And I didn't want to single out any student. It wasn't about that. Every student singled themselves out in my memory. Isn't that extraordinary? And then you have these momentous meetings, which is my experience of meeting you. I can still remember very easily the first time I met you. And that first break where Colleen and I took a break and I met you and Franny, and we just talked for a minute. And I couldn't have foreseen the future because I'm not that psychic, but I certainly had a felt sense that's only ever been borne out in our relationship all these years. And I think it's less about worldview. I think that can help, but I think it's something about this kind of fundamental river underneath the river underneath the ocean or something. And that's extraordinary. And I felt that with that woman that day who said, "You're one of the thirsty ones." I told my friend Simon about that. And he laughed. He laughed. He said, "Yeah, you are, Bobby. Yes, you are." He got that. She would have said the same thing about him. I don't know. I don't want to be disrespectful to you. I suspect she would have said something like that to you. She would have experienced something. And whether it's thirsty one is the right metaphor or not, I got what she was talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, as soon as you said that, I knew what she was saying without actually knowing what she was saying. I mean, that makes sense to me that she would describe you that way, and certainly I would take that as a compliment. If but wait, I was thinking on the oh, she saw you, right?
Yeah, she saw
I mean,
me.
and so as we're thinking about,
It
maybe
wasn't a function of what I had been saying. You know what I'm saying? I think if memory serves, and it's a little bit vague for me, her statement isn't. I think I may have talked or presented information, let's say on addiction for however many minutes. That was so not what she was talking about. It wasn't the content at all.
was not the content. It
No,
was not the
no, no,
content.
no, no, no.
And so as I brought it up as in I was reading that it was worldview and there's something missing there, I thought, um, and the text might have been, felt to me like that was being a bit overplayed, although I still, that's there. But I think that this part, I mean, I think it's important, all of us, it's important that we feel seen. And some people see us better than others, and some people are able to see us better than others.
Yes. Yeah. Mm. I had an aunt. She was my mother's aunt. She was a great aunt. And she had kind of the reputation in my family of being kind of crazy. I'm not even sure as a boy what that meant. All I know is that Aunt Emma was her name. And she's I've told my daughter this, my daughter's daughter, Emma Jane. I love that her name is Emma because that's the strongest association I have to my Aunt Emma. When I was a little boy, she looked like she was 190 when I was a little boy. She was all wrinkly. I can picture. She wasn't married when I knew her, and I don't know if she ever got married. I don't really remember. All I know is that when Aunt Emma looked at me as a little boy, this would be like my earliest memories, maybe 4 or 5 in Texas. I can still picture the crinkle in her eyes and a grin in her face, and there was a sparkle in her eyes, not unlike the woman at that conference that I just talked about, that presentation. And I took that in. And for lots of reasons, I think that was a marker experience for me. I think for reasons maybe of my parents' preoccupation and family and limitations and this and that, and don't need to spend a lot of time on that, other than to say that really landed, feeling really seen by her. And it's really a memory from childhood. And I don't have memories of spending a lot of time with her. It was just beep, beep, like that. But my first sustained experience, which I've shared with you before and shared here before, was when I started 6th grade with Miss Todd, who was also quite elderly as a student. I'm 10 years older than she was when I met her as a student, but at the time I was an 11-year-old. She was old to me for sure. And now I had a year's immersion in what Aunt Emma had laid down. And I really made that connection. It's like, this is the second person in this lifetime who I have this experience with. And a little boy of 11 doesn't have any psychological categories. I can't say, well, her form of vitality mirrors me or something like that. It was just like, my heart, my being oriented towards that. And she became one of the significant formative influences across my entire life. We were dear friends for the next 45 years, Miss Todd. And so on it goes. My high school German teacher, Mr. Hayes, the very same thing. It was immediately experienced and only ever experienced and never stopped. Even after they've both died now, passed away, Mr. Hayes died over 20 years ago, he's still very much a felt presence with me. So it's quite extraordinary what we're talking about being seen. And I can't speak about anybody else's experience, even yours, because I don't know what it's like from the inside, but I know what mine is like from the inside. And that's an indelible imprint and relationship that's formed in these having been seen relationships. I don't forget this woman. I can still picture the woman that said, "You're one of the hungry ones." I can picture as clear as a bell right now. And that was the only thing that we said the whole time, is that comment. Yeah. Or the thirsty ones, excuse me. Thirsty ones. Yep.
Well, and part of me feels like a complete buffoon for pointing this out, but part of me thinks that this is significant because it's about context. And so if that would have been said, especially differentiating between thirsty and hungry, right? Right. And so in a different context, right, is that
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
that could mean something completely different, and you
Yeah.
would have been felt seen in a completely different way. And so it matters how we perceive people seeing us.
Yeah. 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 I flash right now on a book that I have on the bookshelf behind me, and the title of the book is it wasn't written by Carl Jung, but the title of the book is from Carl Jung's writings, where he talks about addiction as a thirst for wholeness, which is the title of the book. And you can imagine, just take that idea of thirst, and we could go with hunger in another conversation, which I nearly did right now, is that I got pretty thirsty for alcohol for and incredibly thirsty for about 15 years straight. And somebody could say, "You sure are thirsty." I would have just felt shamed like shit by that, It's just like, oh, you had to say that. You saw that. Oh God, don't say it out loud. And so it's crazy. And then the reason I think of the book and the reason I think of Carl Jung is that he ennobled it by seeing it three-dimensionally, to realizing, like you're saying, in terms of context. In one context, Bob sure is pounding a lot of vodka. Okay, that's something we can judge. In another context, there's Bob, who's one of the thirsty ones, who's thirsting for wholeness, and the best he can do right now is pound vodka. It's a very different way of holding that. And I had to come to my own relationship to that. And I still am in that relationship. This morning, in my forgiveness practice this morning, as with most mornings, it's coming to a relationship to myself, because the last part of that practice is self-compassion, of remembering to see myself through the eyes of grace. I mean, it's gotten more reflexive for me. It's not hard for me to do that now when I practice it. I'll tell you the truth, is that when I'm out and about in the world, I still am vulnerable to shame. Because I'm not in meditation practice. When somebody tries to shame the shit out of me, I'm vulnerable to that. Having said that, there's a fairly strong recovery mechanism in place right now, no pun intended by that really is all about context, isn't it? It's like I'll take the same thing that I've been shamed for. Let's say Bob's one of the thirsty ones, been shamed, and I certainly have experienced shame myself and stigma professionally and societally for my addiction to alcohol. And I now am able to hold that as an understandable response to the context of my life. And it was the best I could do until I was able to maybe pick some other options. And I feel compassion and sorrow, and I can sometimes cry in my meditations about this, but there just isn't shame in that. That's really extraordinary that can happen in a lifetime. That's
Yeah.
extraordinary.
Yeah. And I like that you brought up that young perspective, because, and it goes back to it matters to me, it matters how I see people, how I talk about the people I work with or myself, but because that is going to then reflect how they perceive me seeing them. And so in my experience in most substance abuse treatment centers and working there, and certainly in being there, is that the thirst about the quote you said about Bob has a thirst for vodka, and that perspective is the prevailing perspective, and it's what I would call like a deficit model.
Yeah.
And so the other perspective that Jung is talking about there in the search for wholeness, that might seem like no big deal. That's maybe a nuance, but that is a big, in my opinion, that is huge. And it can seem, especially if I've been in many staff meetings or clinical consultations in which these kind of conversations are taking place, in which it's the thirst for the vodka, not the thirst for wholeness. And to stand and to take a position on that, my experience is you will be the minority in most. I'm not saying all, but most, and then you're kind of like you care too much about these people, or like
Right.
some sort of you're because it's not that that isn't true, or even, you know what, actually it isn't even always true, like, but people can say that it's true, and I can see how people might. It's not that I'm arguing with the truth of the matter. That's not it. It's about the nuance of the matter, and that's what matters. And if that perspective helped people more, then I would be glad to take it. But I know from being on both ends of it that it doesn't, because I've seen people see that glimmer in my eye when I look at them as seeing them search for wholeness. Yes. Versus searching for vodka. And they know that I see them that way. And then I see the glimmer in their eye.
That's beautifully said. Beautiful, Michael. Michael, I've sat in groups, and I've talked about it here before, including with us, I think. I've sat in group after group over the last 10 years where I'll ask the question, and typically over the course of some group, I'll ask this, not every group, but in any group of that is recurring group, I'll ask them, can you guys tell the difference? I'm just going to use you as an example. Can you tell the difference when you're with Michael, when he looks at you and sees you through these certain eyes in a certain context, with a certain nuance, with a certain sensibility? Can you tell the difference between that and someone else who sees you? Let's just use our example. Can you see when somebody looks at you as nothing but thirst for vodka, as opposed to thirst for becoming who you're meant to be, thirst for wholeness? And I mean, it's just like, bam, all the hands shoot up. Oh yeah. And in fact, what they'll verify. And so I feel like I've got a fair bit of empirical data now. Probably have a few thousand data points on this. It's not a double-blind placebo, whatever like that, but it's a lot of data points. Is that they say they can honestly, absolutely tell that, whether it's with a doctor, therapist, staff, recovery staff person, they can tell that, first of all. And secondly, they confirm what you said, is that it's the exception to the rule to experience the way that Michael looks at me. That's that, and they'll say that again and again. And even by our talking about it, there's liberation, because we're talking about the unspoken dimension and kind of the hidden dimension of these so-called therapeutic relationships. And it can be a sponsor, it can be a partner in recovery, it doesn't matter what it is. And what they'll say is that's the deciding variable. They'll have different languages for that, but it's like, that's the piece that's the pearl of great price. And that's the piece that's that's the hardest thing to find. So how ironic. My response to them will be some variation on this, is that if you think about it from a psychological perspective, particularly a developmental perspective, is that the psychological matrix out of which most of us come is one in which we have not felt seen or respected or held three-dimensionally. And so how could the thing that breeds the brokenness that makes us vulnerable to addiction become its cure? How is doing more of that the solution? Just talking real common sense, and people get that. That's not an experienced, distant concept to realize that the healing, it stands to reason, ought to be in a different medium than what it is that got me here. Thank you very much. And they're very responsive to that. And then the goal is, can we be that with each other? I'll look at them and I'll say, there's more resource in this room of 20 or 30 of us that are earnestly seeking recovery, more resource in this room than virtually any other place you can go to. No disrespect, but it's not going to be in your families. It's not going to be with most professionals you'll deal with. And so you guys, if we can build this here, this is cash in the bank, man. This is where you want to invest your energies. And they get that too. It changes the rhetoric. It changes the interaction. For example, the pecking order of, you're shit because you're addicted to that as opposed to me, that stops. It's just like, that stuff is not okay. Very, very rarely, even in early recovery, I'm struck by this, because you think of pause, post-acute withdrawal syndrome, and all of the erratic whatevers that can happen, irritability and reactivity and so on. I'm struck by how relatively rare it is that somebody loses their shit in one of the groups I lead, because you set this tone, first of all, by being it yourself, because you and I both know firsthand that stuff makes a huge difference. So it's like keeping, as Jung said, the surgeon has to keep his hands clean for surgery. So we keep our hands clean, so to speak, working our stuff. And then you host a certain kind of interaction. And there are times that people go off the rails, but what I'm amazed by, it should be happening all the time. And it's happening relatively rarely. That's extraordinary to me. It's a relief to me, to be honest with you. But it's also like, you're creating a community, speaking of context, you're creating a community or a context of healing. It's happening right now. It's happening right now, right here. And it's probably has the most leverage or traction in this room right now, not someplace else. It's right here, right now. This is it, you guys.
Yeah, I like that. It's happening, you know, because I think it's easy to believe that life is happening somewhere else. Because life and improvement and things getting better are happening somewhere else. And I really like that. I'm just thinking like life happens here, not somewhere else. You know, I was thinking about this idea somewhat earlier, but let's see if I can tie it back. Because I do think this idea is really important in recovery or in anything in life in general, and certainly when we're trying to make any sort of significant change. And so I'm having to write my essays now for internship. And so
wow. Congratulations. That is such a mind blower. That's amazing, Michael. Oh,
yeah.
wow. That is so cool. Wow.
Yeah. And it is cool until I have to sit down and write my essays and
oh, there's that.
Right? The idea of writing the essays is great.
I actually have to do this shit, do I?
Yeah, like no, I'm just glad to have made it to this point where I'm writing the essay. Yeah.
Oh yeah, hallelujah.
Well, I mean, on one hand, but on the other hand, I'm like, I have to write, you know. So it's a double-edged sword, like most things in life. And so I'm kind of having some I don't know if writer's block, but I mean, I have lots to say, but I also have to keep in mind who my audience is. So speaking of context, is the APA basically, I mean, you know, it's representatives.
It's the American Psychological Association, for anybody that doesn't know what he's referring to. It's the governing body of all psychologists, including psychology students and interns, to be in this country. Yeah.
And so I'm, you know, a lot of the things that we're talking about, Bob, don't align with the APA, you know, and in general, I would say that there's certainly, I mean, there's a lot. So I'm having to think about this in terms of, you know, what can I say that aligns with what, you know, like in expressing my values and what, because the first essay is an autobiography, like a professional autobiography, you know, and so I was reading through the internship workbook in which you kind of come up with these essays, and I'm reading through it, and it says something about well, for example, if you're a track star in high school, and you know, and then you can tie that into endurance throughout your process of training, and so just ask you to tie those in, and so I go, okay, all right, there, so. You know, and I'm just trying to like get some. So I go, all right, well, maybe I could. And it's actually things about myself. It did get me thinking about things about myself that I even forget on a day-to-day basis, you know, in terms of, especially when I'm feeling overwhelmed and life might seem problematic, or there's lots of more things that tell me life's a pain in the ass right now than things that are telling me it's great, you know? And so I go, hey, you know what? I've run quite a few marathons and I've done quite a few Ironman triathlons. And then I thought back to the first time I ever thought of an Ironman. And I go, the first time I thought of it, I go, you mean after swimming 2.2 miles and biking 112, then you're going to run a marathon? I go, that's the craziest idea I've ever heard, and I could not even wrap my brain around it.
Oh, God, help us.
And then I instantly thought, I go, well, then how did I get from there, that thought, to doing them? And so I thought about Lev Vygotsky, you know, and this zone of proximal development. And it's basically what, kind of like if you teach someone too high above their head, that they can't grasp it. And so it needs to be within some zone. And also what helps with that zone and kind of help extend someone ahead above is to have what they call a more knowledgeable other. or community or other people who have done it. And so I started thinking about that's how I did it, was through the community in which I was involved, who had done it, and I saw through their eyes that they believed that I could do it. And so it was a continual relational thing. It wasn't a one-time thing. And it was through that I came to do something that I considered completely impossible at one point. And it got me thinking a lot about community, and certainly when someone's going through change and addiction, is that they're making a big change. I mean, they're doing something that might seem insurmountable, that it's just impossible to do. And that is one of the things about AA that is amazing, is that the community that it offers people is significant. And it really is, I think, what does make the difference for people.
Yeah. Thank you. I heard one author refer to it as the community, not to AA, but just to this phenomenon, the community of the adequate. It's what Vygotsky is calling, what you call the knowledgeable other. Yeah,
more knowledgeable other,
the more knowledgeable, the community of the adequate, like adequate to the task of the triathlon, adequate to the task of recovery. And I appreciate you holding that out. Any community that can model for us and hold for us hope that we ourselves might one day be adequate. That's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful gift.
Yeah. I mean, and I wish that there were more, I think AA might stand the test of time in terms of that. I don't know if communities of that size and access level, I mean, because even if you think about it, I've had clients tell me something like, I wish my problem was alcohol or something, like maybe it's depression or or some version of anxiety and depression, because at least if your problem is alcohol, people know where you can go and meet in groups with other people who have the similar problem. And so it's not that they're exactly wishing that problem upon themselves. It's just that they were, and I've heard this more times than one. I don't know if you've ever heard something like this, but it's something that strikes me, and it makes sense to me too.
It does to me too. It's funny. I've been at this for a while. I don't know that I've heard that before, and it may be that maybe I did hear it but didn't hear it. What I'm saying? It didn't register. It registers right now when you say that we could find. It makes me think it's analogous. Over the years, I've moved from thinking about addiction in terms of addiction to substance. That's kind of the most obvious one, in some ways low-hanging fruit in terms of drawing stigma. And as you and I have shared before, that's 1 out of 4 Americans over the age of 12 are addicted to substance. That's no small group. It's 80 million Americans. But then 90% of Americans say that they're addicted to so-called process addictions or behavioral addictions, non-substance related addictions, including sex, compulsive eating, gambling, compulsive work, compulsive internet, compulsive spending, all those kinds of things. That's virtually everybody. And so I've wanted to help destigmatize the conversation about addiction. It's why I've followed this course of looking at addiction etymologically, looking at the root in enslavement. Enslavement conjures up a felt sense that's different than addiction. It seems like to me, it's like trying to find language that will help open it up. And then more recently, in the last year or so, Michael, really looking at addictive attitudes. This is inspired by my friend and our friend Guy Duplessis in South Africa, who's written essays now on ideological addiction. And it led me to realize that so many addictive behaviors, including attitudes, including belief systems, speaking of worldview, is that they can, I did a lot of reading on fundamentalism when I was in graduate school, actually when I was an undergraduate too, and it has all the earmarks. In fact, I wrote an essay on cults when I was teaching at Pepperdine, an article on it that was published, looking at cultic phenomena, looking at ideological, that the book by Eric Hoffer, The True Believer, that kind of phenomenon. It has all the earmarks of addiction. So why can't we include that in the conversation about addiction? And now we're up to like 99.9 it's not a pissing contest. It's just like acknowledging that as humans we get attached to things that help us feel better and ward off other feelings and so on. But
Bob, so I'm sorry, the camera cut out there for a minute. You said 99. I missed it after that. I'm sorry.
I said, you know, you kind of keep closing down the bandwidth when you start including things like attitudes, belief systems, and so on like that. It's just so part and parcel of being human. I think you and I've gotten this from refuge recovery. I know I have for sure. When you look at the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism, is that all of us suffer. And our suffering, the prescription in a Buddhist perspective, is all of us suffering owing to some version of being attached to certain things and aversion to things that bug us. And there we go, we're off to the races. And so it just feels like it's human. And I know that for me, you know, you were talking about earlier, kind of like the lenses through which we see certain phenomena. If I look at a room of people that are in recovery from addiction, I don't have a scarlet A on their forehead any more than I have it on myself most of the time. Some of the time I do with myself. Most of the time I don't. It's just like, it's like a scarlet H. It's like, here we are as humans. Here we are as humans. It feels like to me addiction or enslavement is ontological. It's like hardwired into our humanity. And so is our wanting liberation from that enslavement. So it just gives me a very different standpoint. But when you talk about this right now, I'm getting back to what you said earlier about, is that now you have these dedicated programs that deal with addiction, like Alcoholics Anonymous or Smart Recovery or Refuge Recovery. What a wonderful thing. I can well understand why somebody would be envious if, well, you know, I'm actually addicted to fundamentalist beliefs. I wish there was a group for me. And in fact, there is. But we can go down the list. It's not well known that I can find a group of support for people that suffer from phobias or PTSD or depression or attentional issues. You know, it's like if there could be a way for us to expand the fact that we all need villages to heal within, communities like this, like triathlon communities of the adequate. You know, wouldn't that be a wonderful thing for us to create that? That's very much what Kara was talking about earlier today with her lockdown open up. It's across all manifestations of lockdown. In fact, as we were talking, what hit me is that she devised this in the midst of literal lockdown around the coronavirus. And it's as some of the lockdown is moving through phases and opening up in various countries, continents, etc. I was thinking, what a wonderful metaphor is that we all locked down inside of our private hells. And what if we could open up? And so just stick with that title. That's a great moniker for your organization, is like, can we counter lockdown, which is kind of organismic? Can we counter that by opening up? If it's about depression, if it's about anxiety, if it's about alcohol, whatever the heck it is, if it's, you know, yeah. So I would that we would do that. And I think what you're talking about, back to the American Psychological Association, is there for a way for us to not, this is one of my issues with psychology. I got a lot of issues with psychology, I always did. Is there a way for us to exercise a lot of care about turning psychology into a silo, to like a professional silo? I go to see Bob, I go to see Michael to work on my issues. And since my issues aren't alcoholism, I can't go to a group. So I better keep this on the down low, and maybe Michael or Bob will fix. There's something about that whole mentality, rather than here we are as humans. What are you struggling with, brother? What can we do to offer you skillful means to manage this? Just a different attitude. There's something about the professionalization of psychology over the last 150 years that's disconcerting to the extreme for me. And in some ways it gets worse.
Yeah. The thought that came to mind is a phrase you used maybe a couple of videos ago. There lies the rub for me, because it's the profession in which I'm in.
Yes.
And allowed to, it has to exist in some way for us to be able to help people. But the very existence of it sometimes gives me this pause and this rub around, because it in itself then creates these silos of professional versus client, and it also silos individual problems, you know. And so I'm not a big fan of, and I don't exactly agree 100% with what I'm about to say, but I do to some degree, which is like, I'm not a big fan of working with people that have experienced trauma. You know, in other words, people advertise that they have experience working with specific problems. And certainly I think that's a value. At the same time, I'm just not a big fan of thinking about it that way, because I mean, because it's also, to me, is implicit in that is also that the belief that you've had to experience something to help somebody with a similar problem or something like that, you know. And quite honestly, I like help. Like, I think I can help people the most if it's a problem I have not experienced, because
I like
then
that. I like that.
and so, like, when I do work with people around substance abuse, I
Yeah,
become a
yeah.
bit more, I'm concerned a bit more that I might
Mm,
overlay my experience to
mm,
theirs.
mm,
So and so those antennas aren't up exactly
mm,
quite the
mm,
same way. And so
mm.
who's to say what the outcomes of those are, though? I mean, who's to say what direction that goes? But nonetheless, I like to remain curious and learn about someone's experience. And I think I do that best when I don't know. So it just made me think of that siloing problems too. I'm just not a big fan of it, but also see the value in it. And there
Yeah,
lies the rub
yeah,
too.
yeah. You just brought something to my awareness. I love our conversations. Stuff starts converging for me. Here are two things that I've never once seen the the lack of integration of them, and it became clear to me right now. On the one hand, and I know you've run into this too, how many times have I heard in groups that I'm leading in treatment centers that how can somebody who doesn't know addiction from the inside help me, because I need for them to know it from the inside. That's a recurring motif. Okay, there's that. And then there's the phenomenon that I've also experienced, at least as much as a recurring motif, which is people that are in recovery from addiction keep trying to put on me what worked for them without seeing that I'm not a one size fits all kind of human being. In fact, no one is. So there's that. So I want to work with people that know addiction from the inside. And by the way, the preponderance of them keep trying to get me to do the stuff that worked for them wonderfully, but don't want to help me find what would work for me, because it's got to be like it worked for them. In psychology, we would call it a twinship problem, is that I just assume that everybody's a twin. And so what worked for me is going to work for you. So there's that piece. Now, here's the other piece I've never integrated till right now that I've struggled with, is that when I've asked clients in a treatment center, if they're working with me who does know recovery from the inside, if I ask them if they're working with somebody, I worked in a treatment center where the clinical director was not in recovery from addiction. And they said, we like working with him. And I said, what is it? And it just really stayed with me. This is from the very beginning of the work. They said, they need to know suffering. And implied in that would be they need to know humility, they need to know loss, they need to know being scared shitless, being out of, they need to know that. And this guy did. I knew. I won't go into the specifics out of respect. He knew that, and they could feel that. So there's kind of a radical fallibility, a radical humanness and humility that they knew. So if I bring all of that together, and it's just sparked by what you just said, is that I love what you said, is that the risk of you and I knowing addiction from the inside is that we might do what happens a lot, which is do the same damn thing for clients that worked for us, assuming that they're us, which is never accurate. Okay. And that happens all the time. Drives me flipping crazy in the world of recovery, how that's that kind of twinship thing that goes on, that mentoring model is really fraught with problems, because I had several decades of training in psychology and clinical experience before I got into recovery to know that shit doesn't work in people helping. It doesn't have, you might luck out occasionally. You might get what Freud called a transference cure that lasts about as long as a gnat's life. And that's it. It doesn't have a sustaining value if it's not intrinsic. So I know that from psychology research and from my own clinical experience. And so you and I love what you said, is that far better that we deal with something we don't know, because there's probably a lightness, a humility, a curiosity, a willing to learn from the client, all of that. Now, is there a way that we can retain that beginner's mind for those of us like you and I? This is rhetorical, obviously, but as people that know addiction from the inside, can I approach each client de novo as if I don't know anything about addiction? And that really is what I try to do. It's really like
and it's the hardest thing to do.
Yeah.
And I think that I'm glad you brought up the beginner's mind, because to me, this is my goal, but it's crazy hard.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, and
yeah,
as
yeah.
I gain more experience, it becomes more. And so I can imagine, like, as one is, it's harder and harder as time goes on, but it's all the more reason why that needs to remain
Yeah.
the focus.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. When Carl Jung talked about the work of consciousness is the opus contra naturam, this would be one thing he meant. It's the work against nature. Our brains are naturally wired to be economical. We do pruning of information to simplify stuff. So if I know one addict, I know every addict. You and I both know that's not true, but my brain wants to do that just because life is so flipping complicated. And if there's one thing we don't want is cognitive ambiguity. I want shit to be clear. And so we go boom like this. And so you see this all the time, not only in psychology, but in recovery and so on. And so the opus contra naturam would be doing the work we can to keep the slate. I like what Lao Tzu says in the Tao Te Ching. He says, first you erase the blackboard, then you write something new. And so it's like with every client in every session across our lives to erase the blackboard and then allow something new to be written. And that kind of radical humility is what the psychoanalyst Wilfred Bion says, to operate without memory or desire. It's like to be in somebody's presence. Freud called it evenly hovering attention. It's just hovering. It's not attaching. It's not attaching. That idea of without memory or desire. There's no memory of having been here before. There's no desire to some specific outcome. I'm just going to be radically present with the erased blackboard, and let's create something together. And I think that's what clients say when they say most therapists don't do that. Most therapists have us sized up. They have me diagnosed. They have a treatment plan for my life. And if I don't comply with that, then I'm not taking my recovery seriously. How messed up is that?
Yeah.
Jesus.
Well, to me, it's the difference between leading from the front, which is I'm showing you, or walking alongside someone.
Yeah, that's
and
good.
and
That's
and
good.
I've noticed, and I know we're just about out of time, but I noticed that when I get close to being out of time with clients, that this is when I catch myself doing it. That I know the best way is going to be kind of maybe asking 3 or 4 questions to get to something, but I feel pressured and out of time. And so I jump through the scaffolding that I know I should have built. And it just seems to slap me in the face every time, like, or, that I become aware of that was not the best way. And I still do it, enough to know that it's something that I'll continually have to work on.
I wish I was reading one of your essays for internships and that you would say what you just said. And it actually brings tears to my eyes, Michael. I mean, that's a beautiful thing you just said. Your awareness of that. That's the Pearl of Great Price right there. And if you learn that from triathlons, that's wonderful, or Ironman or whatever the heck. But it's like that willingness to acknowledge that, and that kind of humility. That's what I would want to read in an internship essay. And I doubt that's a heroic in the way that a lot of people would advise, but it's like that's true heroism to me. And I think that that's all we want from parents, from our partners in our lives, from our therapists, our supervisors, our priests. Is it something like that?
What would you call that?
Well, I'm going to resort to a language I'm familiar with, and it may not be the most eloquent language, but I love so much the way that the psychoanalyst Robert Stolorow talks about this, and you and I've talked about it before. He just calls it fallibilism. And I'm sure there's better terms for that for sure. But there's something I'm touched by. It's why it brings tears, because my whole being resonates to that. That's what we're looking for, is just an awareness that this is your leading edge, and it may be for a lifetime, it may be for a year. It doesn't really matter. But just having a leading edge, just having that is very touching to me, and that's what I would want to hear in an essay. It's what we're not encouraged to do. We're encouraged to show our persona, and the last thing I want you to see is the shadow of doubt that I have. And it's it's very touching to me.
Thank you.
Why don't we not race through a bunch of questions at the end here and just be with us? It's such a pleasure to be with you. I know exactly what you're talking about. Also, I have to tell you, it touches close to home. to say the witty thing, to to say that, just to allow silence and breath. I like the last lines of a poem by Rumi where he says, "First, last, outer, inner, only that breath, breathing human being, only that breath, breathing human being." And I like that a lot. I think maybe in some way that pertains. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. I know that your mother, among others, watches this, and I bless her for watching this. It's very moving to me. She'll reach out occasionally through Facebook and respond to you. A family that know you, maybe Franny watches this. I don't know. Friends of yours, maybe at school, but there's so much of worth of what you bring, and I'm glad that you have people in your life that have eyes to see, starting with me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
With
My
me.
mom said something about you, and I said, oh, so you think Bob's hot, huh? I said, I'm going to tell him that. She goes, okay. And so really what she said was,
Now I am hot. Now I am hot, like literally.
so she said, that Bob is a good looking man, is what she said. No, I know. And also I said, so I'm going to tell Bob you have a crush on him. And she just laughed.
Well, tell your mom I have a crush on her son. I love you dearly, Michael. I do have full respect for you. I don't expect that's going to change in this lifetime. It's really a grace. It's really a joy. Okay. All right, my friend. Be well. Thanks everybody for joining us. What a joy, Michael. I wish you a good weekend. Give my love to Franny. Okay.
You too, Bob. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.